signed on as a venue, and it will travel to 2 more university museums at Smith College and University of Wisconsin after it closes here December 30th. So with the one slide that I brought, just the briefest of overview, you can see that it's a multi-artist contemporary art show representing several different countries. Many of the works in the exhibition, which range from sculpture, including textile pieces, video pieces, photography, painting, really the whole gamut of artistic expression in one gallery, are works that are very new. Many of them were even created by the artists in conjunction with development of the exhibition, which gives us a really wonderful opportunity as arts curators to talk to our audiences about how artists are working in response to the global plastic crisis, obsession, however you want to quantify that. And then also, what is plastic providing for artists in terms of different ways of using materials, expanding their own practice. So it's not all doom and gloom about what plastics is doing to the world, but it's also about the possibilities and miraculous qualities of plastic, and artists who are acknowledging how very intertwined humanity is with plastics, and where do we go from there? So the exhibition's organized into 3 sections, looking at the concept of the archive, so the past, the entangled present, obviously what we're dealing with right now, and then speculative future. So what might this look like, and how might artists envision a future, either as plastic continues to tighten its grip on the world thanks to humanity, or how might we overcome or adapt to this? So it's been a really exciting exhibition to have on view with our university and K-12 tours coming in. We've had thousands of students come through at all different age levels to respond to the work. And so this afternoon, if you join us for the tour, we're closed to the public on Tuesdays. We'll be the only ones in that gallery. You can spend about 30 minutes on sort of the formal components of the tour, talking about a few specific works and concepts. We'll have a little more time to go through the gallery if you want some time with pieces. But if you can't join us, or if you think you would want to come back to see it again, I'll leave maybe by the door there some guest passes. And they have the dates of the exhibition on them, but these are good at any time, so if you don't make it to the museum by December 30th, you can still use it even though those dates for the exhibition are printed here. And our fall members magazine has more information about the exhibition and the artists in the show. A lot of the content in the fall members magazine is now wrapping up because we're at the end of this term, but some of the other exhibitions mentioned here are projects that will be on view through winter and spring term. So if you want to use the museum in your teaching, we want to work with you. If you see something of interest in the members magazine, contact Cheryl and me, and we're happy to make those connections. So I think I will leave it at that. I probably used up my 5 minutes, but I'm looking forward to meeting many of you there for the tour. And we do not take a winter break at the museum, so our public hours remain the same through the break. We're closed Mondays and Tuesdays, but Wednesday through Sunday you can come and visit us if you want to come back with your pass. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. And thank you, Doug and Mrs. Doug, and everybody for arranging this. And I've decided to call this the plastics problem, although certainly crisis would be a perfectly adequate word to describe what is going on in the environment as a result of our use of plastics. So I'm going to use this opportunity, a couple opportunities for me. One is that this work on taxation and plastics is really a work in progress for me. It's really hardly anything more than an embryonic idea. But I do attend a conference almost every year called the Global Conference on Environmental Taxation. So I always have to have an idea that comes up, and plastics was the idea that I came up with when I was at the conference this year. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a primer on environmental taxation. So what does it mean to talk about environmental taxation? Well, first you have to have a little bit of an understanding of taxation, which we all do, of course. So taxation is imposed by governments, and its main purpose is to raise revenue for government functions. The typical way that a tax is calculated is by multiplying a tax rate by a tax base, and that results in tax revenue for the government. Of course, there may be some expenses in collecting the tax as well. So an example would be the highest marginal tax rate on taxable income in the US is 37%, so 37% times taxable income. It could also be a unit of currency by a unit of the base. So for example, a tax on motor fuel is, it's actually not $1 a liter here in the US, it's more like the average is 40 cents per gallon. So tax bases can vary. It can be income, it could be consumption, it could be a unit of product. Environmental taxation is of course a form of taxation, but it is used for purposes of changing behavior. It could also potentially raise revenue, and if the environmental tax raises revenue, that also leads to the question of how should that revenue be used? Should it be used for general government purposes? Should it be used to mitigate the problem that was identified as the subject of the environmental tax? So the tax rate could depend on how much revenue is needed to solve the harm that is caused by the product, but that can be very difficult to determine. The tax base is usually units. In the case of a carbon tax, usually tons of carbon emitted, or it can be some proxy for the emissions. And environmental taxation is not only a negative thing, it could be a positive. It could be subsidies through the tax system, or a special lower rate of tax for desired behavior instead of behavior that we want to control. So in discussing environmental taxation, we have to make a number of assumptions. First one, I hope we can all agree on, is that pollution is bad, and that pollution results in societal costs, and economic instruments, like a tax, is a business-friendly way of controlling these problems as an alternative to command and control regulations. So the history of environmental taxation comes down to a gentleman by the name of Arthur Cecil Pigou, we call him AC for short. And he theorized that he was in favor of market freedom, but he theorized that taxes could cure market failures. And market failures occur when there are externalities of products. And those are costs that are created by the products that are not borne by the users of those products, we can also call polluters. So those market failures can be corrected by the government by imposing a tax on those externalities, which forces the polluters to internalize the costs. This is known as the polluter pays principle. So Ballman and Oates, coming later, Pigou was in the 1920s, they determined that, they theorized that as an alternative, the tax rate could be based on the level of environmental protection desired rather than the level of harm. So environmental tax has a number of opportunities to solve environmental problems. They can curb pollution by making polluters pay. They can raise revenue, which has a number of benefits. Other taxes could be cut. It's business friendly because business has the opportunity to determine how to reduce emissions at the lowest cost rather than being forced to take a particular path. And so that can be described as government does not pick winners when it uses environmental taxation. In contrast to command and control regulations, environmental taxation may create an incentive to abate pollution even beyond the standards that are set by regulations. It can improve competitiveness of low-emission alternatives, it can create an incentive to innovate, and transparency and consistency of impact of the taxes. You're not giving a benefit to one particular industry, and it provides cost certainty. So, principles for designing an environmental tax is to target the pollutant. The scope of the tax should be as broad as the damage caused by the pollutant, and the tax rate should be commensurate with environmental damage, although, as we know, that can be difficult. And the tax rate should be predictable with minimal exceptions to avoid getting around the issue. So let's consider plastic. And plastic can be viewed as a miraculous and wonderful material, and you may not be able to read this slide, but the slide, the Tupperware slide says that it's the best thing that happened to women since the vote. And of course, that's the pros of plastics. The cons, of course, are the pollution that has occurred. So some of the externalities of plastics, degradation of natural systems, because the plastic can invade natural systems such as the ocean. Greenhouse gas emissions, because plastics are a petroleum product. So greenhouse gas emissions result from production, and also if those plastics are incinerated from after use, and as Deveron was telling me, can even occur in the case of compostable plastics as those are composted. And there are obviously health and environmental impacts from certain substances that are related and are in plastics, like phthalates and other endocrine disruptors. So business as usual, and there's a very interesting study that just came out from McKinsey, and they have these fun graphs, which I stole to show to you. And so without sustained action, this is about plastics in the ocean. The amount of plastics leaking into the ocean will increase dramatically, and therefore you see the increase dramatic. And then if some actions are taken, the increase will be less dramatic. They predict that by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean. Carbon emissions from plastics are increasing, and this slide shows the plastic share of the carbon budget, which right now is fairly low, but is predicted to increase to 15% of the carbon budget, which is the amount of carbon emitted, by 2050. And plastic share of global oil consumption is currently 6%, and it is anticipated to be 20% by 2050. So that's an illustration of the problem. So how could taxes solve this problem? Well, we have a number of considerations to think about if we want to think about imposing a tax in some way on plastics or plastics product. So one is known as the incidence of the tax. Where is the tax initially imposed? And so really it can be imposed anywhere in the process. An upstream imposition of the tax would be a tax on manufacturers of plastic. Downstream incidence of tax would be putting it on the consumer, on the user of a plastic bag, for example. Also, another consideration is how high should the burden of the tax be? Does it going to be high enough to change behavior? Is that going to be politically possible? Is it going to hurt vulnerable populations? And frequently environmental taxes are viewed as being regressive in nature, as in falling more heavily on lower income people who have to spend more of their income on single-use products. Another consideration, and when I was just speaking with Deveron before this, it gave me more thoughts on this. So of course, another consideration is what level of government should the tax be imposed at? Should it be imposed at a national level, subnational level, state or province level, or a local or municipality? And I was thinking it should be imposed at the municipality, but Deveron has some really good points on that may not be really very helpful. It could even be imposed at a multinational level. So, how about the other side? Environmental tax subsidies. So those could reduce the cost of environmentally friendly products, maybe put a subsidy on paper bags. I don't know if that's better or not. Could help new technologies gain market share and mitigate environmentally damaging subsidies, which we do have in the petroleum industry. And it might be more politically acceptable and more expedient than putting a tax. Cons are that generally subsidies are inefficient. They tend to have windfall effects. People are going to collect the subsidy even though they would do that behavior anyway. It results in the government picking winners, and it has a potentially unlimited budget impact. Finally, the World Trade Organization challenges subsidies Incidentally, which is really sort of funny, there's never been a World Trade Organization's challenge to a subsidy on petroleum fuels. But there have been a number of challenges on renewable fuels. So there are some reasons for that, but it's interesting. So there was a study done by Princeton University in 2013, and they compared a plastic bag tax with a reusable bag bonus. And what they found was the tax on the plastic bags substantially reduced consumers' use of the disposable bags, whereas the bonus for bringing reusable bags had no measurable effect. Okay, so what do we have in our tax system currently that might affect the plastics problem? Well, we have, as I mentioned, incentives for oil and gas production. There also is a research and development credit which might be used for some recycling applications. There are software applications, RFID tracking of disposables to see where they go, and there might be some new technology for recycling that might qualify for the credit. The credit is very complicated. It's an incremental credit. Although there's been some publicity how small businesses can use it, mostly it's been large companies that have used the R&D tax credit. They're very well versed at knowing how to use it and how to navigate it. So it's not really a perfect tool under the existing law. There's also the new pass-through business tax deduction, which might be helpful, though it's certainly not targeted. There's some targeted tax incentives at the state level. So New York has a qualified emerging technology credit, which could be used for recycling industry. Colorado has specifically a plastic recycling investment tax credit. Louisiana has a qualified new recycling manufacturing or process equipment credit. Kentucky has recycling or composting equipment credit. Montana has a recycling credit, and Virginia has also a recycled materials and processing equipment and alternative recycling credit. So we are swimming against the tide to some extent. The US tariffs on imported steel and other products, well, did they prompt China's trash import ban? They seem to be at least coincidental with the trash import ban in China. China is on record as the largest contributor to ocean plastics, but if you trace that through, a lot of that would be due to US imports. So the ships come over, container ships come over from China, they're filled with stuff, and they would go back empty, but then China decided to take our plastics, so they came back with our plastics. So I don't think we can blame China entirely for this particular statistic. Only 9% of plastics have been recycled since 1950, and plastics can take up to 400 years to degrade. So what could we do? We can impose a carbon tax, which would definitely be upstream at the manufacturing level. We could tax straws, we could tax bags, we could increase fees on landfills. Oh, Deveron and I talked about that too. We got a lot to talk about here. We could use a border tax adjustment for imported plastics coming in, or we could target tax incentives like some of the states have. We could do this at a federal level for domestic recycling industry. So finally, any tool can be the right tool, and that is all I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Deveron to give us more practicalities about what's going on here in Lane County. Thank you so much.
Sorry. I meant to mention at the beginning, I combined all of the presenters' slides into one presentation. So the O logo that appears in some of Deveron's slides is a carryover from Roberta, so it's not an endorsement of Yovo. I just wanted to make that disclaimer.
It's just an infection.
Well, thank you so much for that, Roberta. Thanks for having us here, and thanks for coming, everyone. I don't know how many people who are attending by Zoom are from our area, but some of the information I'm going to be providing is very specific to our region, and so as I jump in here, hopefully that part of it will make sense. So I'm an analyst, a waste prevention analyst in the Planning and Development Department here at the City of Eugene, and our waste prevention program is primarily responsible for education around waste prevention in our community, and our operational role is as a regulation and rates and policy team. And so we regulate and help set rates for our local waste haulers. That's given us a lot of flexibility in developing waste prevention programs, and so we're really fortunate to have that operational role because it helps us do the work that we do. And our program goal is really just to make waste prevention and green building practices the norm in our community. So we do that providing, in addition to the rates and regulation, by providing education and outreach and technical assistance to businesses and to local community groups and to students. So let's jump in here. So the regulation piece, as I mentioned, we work with our local trash haulers, and they are private businesses. Our structure here is kind of unique because our trash haulers are not franchised, and it's not just kind of open season. They do actually have to apply for licenses in our community. And in doing so, some of that revenue is how we actually implement some of these waste prevention programs. So it's not funded by taxes directly, it's more the licensing fees from our haulers. People always have questions about that. So some of the programs that we work on are can placement, for example, making it so that your neighbors can't leave their cans out on the curb to retain their parking spots or for whatever other reason. And we work with our compliance team on making that happen. We're also the team that was responsible for the bag ban here in Eugene, which some people love and some people do not love. And so we'll kind of jump into the recycling piece. And as Roberta noted, calling it a crisis is definitely not out of line. I mean, people in Eugene are culturally recyclers, I think, and we've done a lot of work in our community to make that part of our culture. So there was a lot of consternation about the recycling changes that happened, and we definitely did our best to let people know that the things that are accepted into our recycling stream here are actually accepted because that's what our haulers can market as commodities. And it wasn't really that we changed the rules, we were just letting people know that certain commodities were no longer actually a commodity. They had become essentially trash because there was no market for them. So for those of you that have offices here in town, or even here on campus, generally speaking, this is really the whole group of material that can go in our commingled recycling. There are opportunities to recycle other things in our community. We're very fortunate in that regard. But really, when you're coming to your recycling bin in your office, the only things that belong in here is this tiny little grouping of material. And so, a lot of the time people have questions about that. They want to talk about like the numbers on the recycling, and so we'll kind of dive into that a little bit. If anyone has any questions, we can get to those towards the end. And this was an interesting graphic because this market adjustment had been something that China had been talking about for quite some time. We knew it was coming. We didn't actually know when they would really do it because they've been saying that it was going to be implemented for years before it actually happened. And so then one day it actually happened, and we put together these graphics, which we've gotten some pretty festive feedback on. People did not like this. They did not like when to help throw it out either. That did not seem like positive messaging to people, but really our goal was to let people know that a lot of these things had never belonged in the recycling, and that wishful recycling was one of the things that led us to where we are now. Although, I think that we heard a really interesting point about the strange connection between the timing of the tariffs and this import ban. It's very possible that there's larger reasons for when it happened. So, again, a lot of people have, myself included, before I got into this line of work, have been kind of, going along thinking that things like milk cartons were recyclable, which they are not, and they really haven't ever been. They're not made of waxed paper, which a lot of people think that they are. It's like layered plastic and metal, and they're engineered to keep food aseptically safe, and they are almost impossible to recycle here in our community. Milk jugs, on the other hand, totally still recyclable, so please feel free to continue putting those in there. And again, I just always like to take 2 passes at this messaging. All of this stuff is trash. And as much as it feels strange to put things that you think should be recyclable into the garbage, it is crucially important that we all do so, because there is definitely an impact from plastic that is improperly recycled, and a link between that and the plastic pollution that we see. That leakage that Roberta referred to earlier is really kind of a different way of just saying that if we put the wrong things in the bin, a lot of the time they'll end up in the ocean. So we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanism by which that happens, because, I mean, I know that we're not just running down and hurling it into the river ourselves. So just a quick kind of detour into recycling by the numbers. A lot of people ask why they can't recycle something that has the little chasing arrows symbol on the bottom of it. Those are actually resin codes, and they're intended for the manufacturer. And there have been communities that have used those as part of their recycling education campaign, which is good, I guess, in some senses, and it's also very confusing for people because ultimately it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not that actual object can be recycled. It's really based on the market for not just that resin, but the preparation of that commodity and the shape of the object that it's made out of. Especially here in Lynn County, our recycling system is almost entirely shape-based, so it doesn't matter what the chasing arrows number is, it matters what shape the item is. So that's why with plastics, we're saying beverage bottles. I get questions from people that say, well, I have a shampoo bottle that's also a number 2, and it's also a bottle, could that be recycled? And depending on how interested the person is in hearing the answer, a very, very long answer, ultimately we get to a yes. But as you can imagine, when you develop programming materials that are for the entire community, trying to get into some of those gray areas causes more problems a lot of the time than it solves. Another point is that a lot of the plastics, based on which resin they're made of, are really not manufactured in a way that has intended them to be recycled. There's very limited to no producer responsibility in our nation or our state. And so a lot of the things towards this end of the spectrum are made, and there's really no intention that they would ever be recycled, or even in many cases reused. And so a lot of what we actually see going into our commingled recycling stream is on this end of the spectrum, and that definitely limits the type of items that we're able to accept into the system. And that means that there's lots of stuff that gets made that never even has an opportunity to be recycled. But it still feels weird to throw it in the trash, and that's when people kind of get into this wishful recycling mode. And so landfill impacts, I'm sorry, weird bleach out on the top of that slide. I hope you guys can see this, and we're going to come back to this slide, I think, towards the end here, and see how we're doing on time. So almost everything that we're seeing in our actual landfill here in Lynn County, because the county is who is in charge of actually collecting and charging tip fees for materials that are collected in this greater Eugene Springfield area, is wood and food. And as probably almost all of you know, those have impacts far beyond just the space they're taking up in the landfill. Significant impacts. They produce methane as they degrade. They're definitely items that have a higher and best use from the standpoint that if they weren't in the landfill, they could be composted or otherwise turned into some kind of useful product. And then you can see over here that rigid plastic packaging, which is not recyclable in our commingled system, is about 3% of what we're seeing. The other plastic packaging, same thing. Plastic products, that 4%, that's really kind of that commingled margin there. That's usually what we're seeing that's not being correctly recycled, that's ending up in the landfill. And so we see plastic in the landfill, and we're going to see a little bit more now that this recycling market shift has happened, but it's definitely not the lion's share of what we're trying to manage. And it's also an inert material that compacts pretty well, and when it's sequestered in our modern sanitary landfills, actually has very few impacts. They're lined, it doesn't cause leachate, they're not methane producing, and so on. And so the wishful recycling component, where we are taking our materials that we really don't want to throw away because it seems like they're too good and they should be recycled, causes all kinds of impacts in the processing phase. And that's sort of kind of another piece of how we sort of got to our crisis level proportions with plastics. So a lot of the facilities that manage the stream of material that come out of our area actually end up doing a very precursory sort and then sending that material up to material recovery facilities, also known as MRFs, in the Salem and Portland area. And this is a picture from one of them that I was just at the other day. And as you can see, this is just all like toys and garden equipment and all kinds of stuff that they're pulling out as these bales are coming in from their local haulers. And that's kind of what the pile looks like. You know, when they're unpackaging this, it's just mixed, and you look at it, and there's a lot of stuff that just is clearly not recycling in there, including tons of plastic bags, which are probably the most impactful material that ends up in our recycling stream that does not belong there, because they tend to ruin the equipment that's used to sort the recycling and cause all kinds of equipment damage and facility stoppages and things like that. So when you see this pile, it's just kind of interesting because there's so much plastic film in there and it really, really doesn't belong. And then of course, I just thought this was hilarious. They have this wonderful collection of little toy dinosaurs that they're pulling out because of course somebody really wanted them to get reused or recycled, and that's probably how they end up in the recycling bin in the first place because they're really cute. So this picture right here is actually from a recent National Geographic article that was pretty kind of eye-opening, yeah. And so I love this picture because I think it also brings into a little bit of focus like how this recycling sorting is actually occurring in some of these East Asian countries. It's not going through a MRF there, it's actually being hand sorted and pretty much just high graded. These people are pulling the green plastic bottles out because they can get a good price for those. The rest of it is just going to sit there until it eventually, in some kind of weather event or other event, ends up washing into a river and then out into the plastic garbage pit. And as you can see, the Yangtze has a really large footprint when it comes to how much of that plastic is actually hitting the Pacific Ocean. So I think another thing to note at this point too is that one of the reasons that China has made the decision to stop accepting our recycling / trash, because that's really what it was, also has to do with the fact that they want a clean environment also. And so having this sort of unregulated recycling processing occurring in China was causing environmental impacts there as well. And quite reasonably, they didn't want to keep having to deal with that. And it's also not a good look. And they've definitely done a lot to try to clean up their image as far as being one of the global polluters. So about 80% of that plastic that we see out in the garbage patches is coming from land-based activities in North America and Asia. And when we say North America, it's probably not coming down out of our rivers, but it's definitely coming out of our homes and being shipped all the way to China and then washing down their rivers. So when people feel kind of a sense of loss that they can't continue to recycle some of the plastics that we've all been accustomed to putting in our big blue bin, I always just like to point out that those plastics are really much safer in our landfills. They're not going to wash out into the ocean, they're not causing plastic pollution there. It is unfortunate that we have to throw them away, but really the only solution is to not purchase them or to look at some of these taxation or producer responsibility options, because as soon as we make it so that producers have an incentive or a reason to find a better way, a different way, a more responsible way to do their packaging, things will change much more quickly. And we can do a little bit, I think, as consumers by not purchasing things that are in packaging that we know is going to be recyclable or reusable. And then I also think that to a degree in local government, more so in state government, we do have opportunities to implement some of the solutions that Roberta was outlining in her presentation. And so it'll be very interesting to see where we go from here. So I can't do a presentation like this without talking about food waste. I've always got to bang that food waste drum. Because as we saw in that slide here, oops, sorry, went too far. You know, food waste is really a significant portion of what's going in there, and that we do have direct control over as consumers and in our households. We do not have to put food waste in the trash. And backyard composting admittedly cannot be something that's available for everybody, but in short order here, we're actually going to have a residential collection program in the next 2 or 3 months. You should see that roll out. And we apologize for the delay, but every time you do something like this, there's a certain amount of political capital that you have to invest as well as money. So we've been working on that really hard for the last couple of years. And of course, we've had a commercial program available for restaurants and universities. U of O is like a huge participant in the food waste collection. In local schools for 7 years. So since 2011, we've been collecting a lot of this food waste. Now, this 40,000 tons of food that we're throwing away as Eugene, about half of that is from the commercial sector and half of it's from residences. So it'll be interesting to see what our landfill composition looks like in about 10 years. Hopefully there'll be a lot less food in it. So the commercial program is pretty simple. It essentially is, collect the food, put it on a truck. It either goes out to JC Biomethane and gets turned into fuel, or it gets turned into compost at Rexius and then we bag it and sell it. And what I love about this, we don't actually sell it, Rexius sells it. But since we have the trademark for this product, that little kind of type that you can't read on the bottom, that's basically the story of what we're doing here in Eugene. And this product is sold up and down the West Coast. So we get lots of communities that are interested in how this program works and how this public-private partnership worked. And it has been directly responsible for the implementation of composting in other communities. So I love that. I think it's really cool. We also do a lot of work around the food waste reduction component in schools by dressing up like ridiculous vegetables. And the compost that the students are actually in part making by collecting their food waste in schools goes back to their school gardens, and then they get to grow food with it and learn more about that closed loop cycle. For any of you that represent businesses here, we have some business assistance programs that we've funded up until recently. The county just took this one over, where you can get recycling information brought directly to your office here in town, and it's free. And they'll essentially walk you through not just how you can recycle more, but how you can save money by recycling. And it goes all the way into like energy efficiency and some other things that sort of fall outside of the realm of this presentation. And then people that go through that program are eligible for the Mayor's Gold Steps Award. And just a few more things about recycling. There's a construction and materials management program that we just started in partnership with Bring that's diverting construction and demolition debris. So we're trying to get to that wood sector of what we're seeing in our landfills. And then we do a lot of work with sustainable events, like a lot of the big track and field events here in town. We've helped get third-party certified and to really start looking at their impacts, especially from the recycling, plastics, and food waste standpoint. And we also provide water bottle refilling stations for any local events. And so if you want to make sure that you're getting away, again, from those plastic bottles at the events that you might host, these are available for anyone in the greater Eugene, Springfield area. And so that's it for my slides. Thank you very much.
I think we're a small enough group that people can just raise hands and you all can call them.
Okay, I have a rat question.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think
love
this is,
one.
I think the rat question, I think it's an urban myth, but maybe you can explain. So the rat question is, of course, there's a rat problem in Eugene, and it's being blamed on composting food in people's backyards. So, also on chickens, but that's.
So it's true. There's a rat problem in Eugene, and it's probably mostly from the chickens. It's definitely from people who have open compost piles in their backyard. Composting should be done properly. We're looking forward to the residential food waste collection rollout because those containers are a lot more rat-proof than a composter, and we actually anticipate seeing a decrease in rat issues because of the fact that the food waste is going to be contained. So a lot of those backyard converters and composters can convert to that system if they choose to, since it's not going to have an additional cost associated with it. But we also do not bait our drains and sewers in Eugene for environmental reasons, and a lot of communities do that, and so there are some impacts from that. So I don't know if anything's going to change with that. We've seen less issues this last year than we did the previous year, so hopefully that will improve. But that's a great question, we get it all the time. We're like, no, residential composting will help as long as people put it in the right bin, so that's our answer to that.
So I had thought that I had read that Eugene is accepting no plastics, and I felt like this was like, and then everybody was freaked out because no plastics were being accepted, but that's incorrect. You can put beverage things. Okay, and then so kind of as an organizer, I'm curious if there's been difficulty getting your message out, because there were also, you know, articles in the Register Guard and things on Facebook about collect your number ones and number twos and number whatevers, and so many of us were like teaming up to collect these certain things, and that was what was put out there, was collect by these numbers. So are you just up against?
The county did a plastics roundup recently that was really heavily publicized, and it was super cool, and they collected 2s, 4s, and 5s, I think, at the county's facility. And so they were like, save it up, bring it to us, and everybody did that, and it was super fun, and it was like 2.97 tons, which like is not that much. So they're trying to figure out ways to roll that out and actually kind of do those collection points throughout the community, so that it's more efficient, and we can actually, you know, collectively as a community, like collect a significant amount, more than, you know, 3 tons. But it relies heavily on Denton Plastics out of Portland being able to accept the material. So the reason there was a lot of publicity about that is because it had to be like squeaky clean, sorted by item, and it had to be brought to a certain location, and a lot of people were really into it, and then other people are just never going to do that. So, you know, we're hoping that Denton keeps accepting this stuff, because if at any point they stop, then we won't be able to do that at all. But it's interesting because we do a lot of like social media outreach, and we had, you know, a lot of media coverage and games that we put out and RG stuff, and it was all buried under the bigger hubbub about the recycling market shift. And so many communities in Oregon just cut plastics out completely. The exception being Multnomah County. They're still taking everything that they took before, even though a lot of it's actually being landfilled, because they're hoping that the market will correct at some point. But they don't want to make a change and then change back, which I totally understand. So that part of our recycling system is, it's dumb that we can't all be on the same page and make sure that everyone everywhere, at least in the state, is able to collect the same material. But when you're dealing with private businesses and different landfill requirements in different communities and counties, it gets unnecessarily complicated. It definitely dilutes the message in a way that is not ideal.
And then one short comment, when in doubt, throw it out. Like, I actually stand in front of my garbage and my recycling and have that phrase in my head. So it works for some people.
Good to hear.
I guess I have a longer term sort of economic question that ties your 2 fields together. The slide that you showed that from the manufacturing perspective is excellent. And I could actually see borrowing it for my classes. Are there conversations that you're aware of between the recycling, the recovery facilities and the manufacturers? Because back when I was first in college, recycling was so exciting and everybody said it creates jobs. So it seems like a massive economic waste that manufacturers would be interested in creating packaging that is suitable for being recycled right here in the United States.
I agree, and I think that probably is the conclusion that they eventually will come to.
Although I think that we could, in a government role, could help manufacturers come to that conclusion by either putting a price that they would have to pay if they used non-recyclable packaging, or by creating incentives for them to do that.
Absolutely.
Because I think, Deveron, you said this too, they really don't, manufacturers don't have any incentives. to limit their packaging, other than if consumers demand it. And some consumers do, some companies are interested in that. There is a designation, which is not a government designation, but a B corporation, which you may have heard of, the Benefit Corporation, which a number of, Patagonia is one. There are a number of them here in Eugene. And that's a corporation that can operate in the corporate form, but has some insulation from shareholder lawsuits that they are not maximizing profits. So we operate in the United States under this shareholder primacy system of corporate governance, that corporations aren't supposed to do anything that does not increase profits for their shareholders. So if there is a cost to doing business in a more environmentally friendly way, they are subject to being sued by their shareholders for that. If they become a B corporation, they are to some extent insulated from that. That's not universally available in the United States. If we were to adopt laws, whether regulations or taxes that would force corporations to, or businesses to create recycling-friendly packaging or to do recycling, then that would also insulate the corporate boards from being sued by their shareholders for not maximizing profits, because corporations have to comply with laws.
Right.
So, I mean,
I think that's a great point, and I think it's like Royal Dutch Shell, just because of shareholder pressure, decided to start considering linking executive compensation to like carbon reduction in their operations.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was like an interesting, but again, it's like, it's the shareholders, not the consumers, that are driving that change. It's not the corporation just woke up one day and said, well, let's do this. So.
yeah, and I think it also depends on how closely the manufacturer is tied to the packaging. You know, if you go to Walmart and you buy something, are you going to blame Walmart if the item is packaged in a way that's not friendly? There's not that linkage between the two.
That's a great point, because there's not a lot that I think that in local government we can actually do to affect the products that are sold on the shelves of corporations that operate within this locality. There may be, you know, some tools like that Roberta outlined that are potentially something that can be implemented, but those work a lot better if they're at the state level at least, because then you're not restricting our economic development as a community by putting, you know, requirements on businesses that operate within Eugene but nowhere else in the state of Oregon. You can see how that would be a little bit of a hard sell.
Yeah, that's really a leakage problem. We talk about plastic leakage, but that's also kind of a commercial leakage if we only have a law that's just on our little island here in Eugene. Companies that operate outside, and also consumers are free to go outside as well.
Yes.
Are you aware of any studies that track what happens to plastic when it gets to, say, for instance, China, as far as what's actually, you know, reused and then what's dumped apparently into the main seas and goes out into the ocean? Is that part of a government agency in China? I know China used to operate under, they only had certain government agencies doing everything, and now they become capitalized, you know, instead of private industry. But has anyone ever followed? I'm sure someone has. But are you aware of any studies where they follow what happens to it when it gets to China?
I would be surprised if there isn't a study, but there isn't one that I'm aware of.
Well, actually, I would be surprised if there is, because I think it's difficult to do that sort of research within China. I don't think they.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
I mean, there could be like a study, but who knows how accurate it would be.
right, exactly. So there's been difficulty getting information out of China for a lot of things. I mean, carbon emissions, that's been difficult. I mean, certainly what Deveron showed, I mean, you can see the output, right? You can see what's coming out of into the ocean, but in terms of tracking that from a government policy standpoint, I think that would be
Well,
difficult.
I think that was some of, I mean, I've heard, and I don't know how accurate this is, that some of the information about the why that China has made some of these decisions about limiting imports of recycled materials is that they're actually sort of using it to indirectly shut down some of these quasi-gray area facilities, because it's the easiest way to put them out of business, because they're not necessarily regulated. And so some of these sorting facilities the easiest way to prevent them from continuing to operate is to just completely cut off their source of material.
Yeah, and also another thing about China, which I think is not universally known, we have this concept that China is very much centrally governed, but they're really not. There's a lot of local autonomy, there's actually a lot of local corruption in terms of government officials, and so I think that could play a part. And maybe the central government figures this is a way to cut down that corruption in the local governments as well, so.
Why do they all end up, why does so much end up in the Yangtze River? Is that where the stuff that we ship back over there ends up in some sorting facility there where they just pull out a few pieces and then dump the rest in the river?
I mean, that's kind of the operating theory as far as how it's been presented to me. And I think that, plastic being a lightweight material and those areas traditionally having like very high rainfall probably contribute to that, because if you just leave it laying around, it's going to flow and or wash into the nearest body of water, and the Yangtze is a big river. So, but I mean, almost all of the rivers on this slide are East Asian, I think with two exceptions that are Indian.
I guess that's it. Thank you to our presenters.
Question there.
Others?
So with the food production and packaging of food, a lot of it is tied into, with plastics, it's tied into the idea of it being more sanitary. Is there certain materials that provide that sort of sanitation from picking it up in the store to storing it at home that could be an alternative?
There's some interesting stuff that's very much in its nascent stage. There's all kinds of, there is actually even a product, I think, and I can't remember the name of it, that's a food grade polymer wax type of material.
There's the beeswax, there's
Oh,
remember what that's called, that
Yeah, the
beeswax
fully
thing?
beeswax.
It's like fabric that's impregnated with beeswax, and you can wrap it over a bowl or whatever to,
Yeah, there's like a
Instead of
treatment for
plastic.
produce too, where they're actually coating it in this food grade coating that's supposed to increase its shelf lifespan. But a lot of the stuff with food waste, I mean, to be honest, is that we have completely irrational ideas of what wholesome food even looks like. And sell-by dates are completely made up for the most part. So the lack of just our education as consumers and this kind of idealized notion of what our food should actually look like. And because it's so cheap, we can be really picky too. If food was more expensive, I think we'd see things change in a hurry. So yeah, I mean, plastics do play a role in that, and a lot of the food waste happens in the supply chain. So it's not like we can just get rid of it completely and expect that not to happen, guys.
that's subsidies too. Why food is cheap, that's a subsidy story as well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.